Okay, good morning.
Hi, how's everyone?
It looks
Good
like
Hi,
morning.
Jeffrey.
Hillary, the hurricane,
Hi, Deepak.
decided to treat us relatively mildly.
Hi, Jeffrey.
Okay, our
Hi,
first,
Deepak. How you doing?
hi
Good.
Jeffrey, a brief intro for you. Our first presenter, Jeffrey Martin, has done just an enormous amount of research into non-dual states and stages in human beings, about more than about anybody else we know. He is also our Dean for Research at CIHS, and he's joining us from South Africa, I believe. Jeffrey Martin.
That's right. Hello from South Africa. I put up my slide from CIHS so that I'm there with you virtually, at least, even though I'm way, way down here. I can literally look out my window at the ocean, and across that ocean, the only thing that's there is Antarctica, which is kind of a crazy thought, right? All right, so varieties of fundamental well-being. They're talking about the varieties of consciousness section of this conference. And what I thought I would do would just be quickly go through some of the different types of what we call fundamental well-being, which you might know by more vernacular or common words like enlightenment or non-duality or persistent mystical consciousness, unity consciousness, God consciousness. We have close to 300 terms at this point cataloged for these from traditions and individuals and whatnot all over the world. And I think it's important relating to this neuroscience conference because it shows you the complexity that's involved with a study like this. We're not going to deal too much with the neuroscience side of this today because, frankly, there hasn't been nearly enough neuroscience done on it. It's still very much been in the pre-stages of getting the basic sort of categories of this together so that the neuroscience can be dug into by what I'm quite sure will be many future PhD students, because it's going to take an awful lot of them in order to really dig into and get to this. Okay, so first thing we want to look at is basically an overall map for this. So this is our fundamental well-being matrix. And you can see along the bottom here, we've got the different types. And we'll talk about some of these today. We won't have a chance to talk about all of them. So these are literally different kinds of things like enlightenment or non-duality or persistent mystical consciousness or whatever. And then for each one of these, there's also a depth that can be associated with them. Now, there's more than 4 of these, but these 4 are the most common. And so we're going to just talk about them today. More or less, it'd be very rare for you to meet anybody who went beyond layer 4. It'd be very rare for you to meet anybody who was even in location 4 or went beyond location 4, right? So we're in pretty common territory, as common as this can be, given the subject matter. This is another way to think about it. These are, in a way, different, distinct locations. And so, location 1, layer 1, location 1, layer 2, location 3, layer 3. Now, notice I've put a gradient behind each of these, and it's because they're collections of a related experience. So location 2, layer 2, for instance, is a collection of related experiences. It's not just one experience. It's not an experience that every single person is going to have the exact same version of it. Some people will have the same version of it. Other people will have a slightly different version of it. And so this whole thing is a continuum, this way and this way. And it's important to keep that in mind, again, because of the complexity of attempting to study this from a neuroscience perspective. Now, there's a few different ways that you can be on this matrix, right? So one way is that you can have a dominant place on it. And this is traditional in a lot of the cultures and religions, the philosophical systems that dealt with fundamental well-being in some way. They often had a preferred range or a preferred place within fundamental well-being, sort of a dogmatically sanctioned, if you will, place within the entire schema or the landscape that is this very broad way of experiencing the world that we refer to as fundamental well-being. So for instance, location 3, layer 3 is basically the home of the Christian mystic tradition. And that's where you want to go. That's where you want to stick. That's where you want to deepen. You want to go to location 3, layer 3, as an example, right? So that's not uncommon. A Buddhist tradition, for instance, might have a range of them. It might be, for instance, depending upon the sect, location 2, layer 2 to layer 4, as an example, or maybe even over to location 4 in layer 4, depending. And so this has really been discovered by a lot of people, and it's been institutionalized even all around the world. And one way that it's been institutionalized has been by saying, look, location 3, layer 3, that's where you should be at. And so that's one way of looking at this. It's anchoring your perspective of how you're seeing the world in a specific place. We also refer to that as having a dominant perspective that you're operating from, basically. So another thing that can happen is you can be fluid across these, and it can be a very rare type of fluidity, so you might, for instance, change from location 2, layer 2 to location 2, layer 3, and that might happen over the course of months, right? And it might only happen once every few years or once every decade or something like that. It could be a very rare event, or you can have something called hyperfluidity, which is your system really being very loose with these. And so in this moment, as I'm talking to you, perhaps something like location 2, layer 1 or layer 2 is the best place to do this communication from. And so my system might snap into that if I'm hyperfluid. And then if we take a break for some reason, my system might move to another place right away. Again, just very much automatically in the background. And in fact, you can have this be extremely fluid. So I might be sitting somewhere. For instance, maybe I'm sitting out and there's a beach on the other side of the window, on the other side of the camera here. Maybe I'm sitting out on that beach and I might have somebody come by and want to talk. That might switch me into a certain place on the matrix. And then that person might move on and I might look at the sea. That might immediately switch me to a different place. In a way, it's like your system optimizing your current experience within fundamental well-being for maybe what's most appropriate or what you prefer, what you've kind of trained it to do. There's all sorts of, again, complexity here, but you get the idea. The idea of fluidity is fairly simple. And then there's one called integration. And with integration, you're integrating 2 or more layers together within a given location. You don't integrate locations. Locations are always distinct. However, if you're in, say, location 2, you can, in fact, integrate, say, locate layer 1, 2, 3, 4. You can have any 2 of those or all 4 of them integrate. And what that means is that your perspective isn't really fixed in any one of them at any given time. And so I'm not even moving between, say, layer 1 and layer 2 as my experience changes. They've kind of formed a meta composite, if you will, where they're all visible at the same time in your experience. And so instead of jumping from one layer to the next as you're going moment to moment in your life, instead this sort of composite of 2 or more layers is staying with you. And so that's what we mean when we refer to as integration. So those are the 3 ways that this can be experienced. Already a fair amount of complexity, right? From a neuroscience study standpoint, and we haven't even gotten to defining the locations or the layers. So it turns out there's actually a 3rd leg of this. Here you see the layers of depth. Here you see the locations or the types. And then there's this over here, which we don't have any time for today in a 20-minute presentation. But this is another way that fundamental well-being is colored. The experience of fundamental well-being is colored. And it's from an animalistic continuum, essentially, to a celestial type continuum. You can probably get the gist from those words enough to know sort of what coloring might be involved there. It's all 3 of these that actually combine together to form your experience of fundamental well-being if you're experiencing it at any point in time. All right, let's go through the locations So location 1 is by far the most common location, and it's the least recognized across all of the world's traditions and philosophical systems. The vast majority of them mostly just skipped over it and didn't really refer to it at all. It's a deep shift inside you away from a sense of fundamental discontentment, which is really in our nervous system and baked into all animals' nervous system, right? And it makes sense because it's for survival. At any given time, roughly in humans, about every 90 seconds, the system is performing checks. And those checks are often in the background, but they can arise to change your subjective experience in the foreground. And that check is everything okay? What the system is basically saying is, hey, wait a minute, everything might not be okay right now. Let's just check and make sure everything's okay, right? Let's make sure that as I'm focusing on the camera, talking to the camera, that the ceiling isn't actually cracking and falling in, right? Or whatever else. And so the result of this is that we all live with kind of a fundamental, if you're a human, sort of 90-second to 90-second discontentment in the system. Well, if you look at the way the brain is made up, it's basically built up in layers from really the oldest parts of the brain to the newest parts of the brain. And it's really a giant inhibition system. It's not so much about activating your whole brain as your experience of the world being controlled by parts of the brain being inhibited, linking to other parts of the brain, and so on. So if you think about at this very base level, this rhythm occurring where things don't seem quite right every 90 seconds or so, that forms an experience of the world, the average human experience of the world, which is that something is not quite right. And thus we wind up with kind of a baseline of fear and worry and anxiety as the foundation, really, of human subjective experience. That's what changes with the transition to fundamental well-being, and specifically to location 1. That goes away, and what it's replaced by is a sense that things are fundamentally okay. Somehow, even if, your boss just fired you and is like, you're never going to work again in this industry, I'm going to ruin you, right? Or your spouse left you and took the kids and took all your money and started bad-mouthing you to everybody, or no matter what catastrophe you can imagine in your life, if you're in a persistent form of fundamental well-being, when you look down past sort of those surface ripples of emotion and discord in the system, somehow, paradoxically, you find a deeper layer where it seems like everything is still, maybe inexplicably, but nonetheless fundamentally fine. So that comes in with location 1. And along with it, typically a reduction in self-referential thoughts, which is the majority of your thoughts. They're the thoughts about you, right? The thoughts that are often very negative. An old friend of mine used to say that, used to ask people, hey, that voice in your head? Yeah, sure. Okay, well, if I take that voice out of your head and, trap you in an elevator with it, how would that be for you? And the person, everybody's like, no, I got to get away from that voice. I don't want to be trapped in an elevator with it. Well, you're trapped in your head with it, right? All the time. So there's a reduction in that, a reduction in its emotional salience, negative events and, negative triggers, psychological triggers and stuff like that. They fall off much more rapidly. It's a much, much, much better way of experiencing the world. Location 2 brings something called non-duality. Now, non-duality leaves us and comes back at different places in the matrix. In this case, in location 2, it's kind of a lighter form of non-duality that can exist at location 4, where it starts to get to be a much more solid form of it. What does that mean? That basically means that it doesn't really feel like there's a difference between you and everything else. Now, lots of people take this to an extreme, and they think, oh, when I hear someone else's voice, if I were a non-dual, their voice should sound like I should have some identity with that voice, right? It should sound no different than I'm identified with my own voice when I'm talking and things like that. There's all these mental constructs that are built up around it. And in fact, it can be very subtle. It can go through the experience where the other person's voice, is just like yours as far as your own internal experiences. You're kind of talking through them to you, which is talking back. And certainly that's a non-dual experience that can exist, but there isn't really sort of one standard non-dual type experience. They can go from very lightweight to the opposite of that, to a sort of a very extreme, all-encompassing form of it, which causes a lot of confusion in the spiritual space where different teachers talk about their own experience of non-duality, and you often hear these differences. The great thing about this is that location 2 begins to bring the peace more into the foreground. So in location 1, it's, again, kind of the lightest version of fundamental well-being, which means that even though that peace is there in the background, it might not be as there often in the foreground. And that can confuse people. They can feel like they're moving in and out of fundamental well-being when they're really not. What's happening is some psychological triggers coming up, and the peace is being suppressed a little bit, and they have the emotions from their boss firing them or whatever else, sort of more in the foreground and dominating their subjective experience. And they think, oh, I've fallen out of fundamental well-being. But if they'll stop and take a look down deep, they'll realize, oh, no, wait, I still feel like everything is fine. In location 2, that peace that comes with that starts to pull more dominantly into the foreground from a moment-to-moment type of experience. Same things continue to happen. Self-referential thoughts continue to fade. Their saliency continues to fade. As you go deeper and deeper into location 2, you wind up with a very positive emotional experience of the world. And eventually, if you go far enough, you wind up actually with a non-emotional experience of the world. Location 3 is marked by a single positive emotion that has at least a few components. Joy and love are really chief among them. Compassion is often a third one that is in there. And then you have other things that can be mixed in depending on culture and belief system and stuff like that. Now, this is a universal joy. This is a universal love. This is a universal compassion. It's not a personal. There isn't a personal emotionality at location 3. There's only a universal, which can be felt as divine, or not have any sort of divine-like component and can be felt as more universal or panpsychist or something like that. Again, this is the classic end of the Christian mystical tradition, especially in the layer 3 form of it. And it feels amazing. You feel like you're sort of continually merging in with either the divine or sort of an all-conscious kind of experience of reality. But again, it's dualistic again. So there's you merging in with something else, right? It's not just one thing like you have with non-duality in location 2 or location 4 and later. There is something there that you're clearly separate from, that you're merging in increasingly with all the time. And then location 4, it's sort of like falling off a cliff after these. Like location 3 is sort of the peak human experience, if you will. And you're kind of starting to get beyond what we might consider traditionally to be human experience by the time you're making it to location 4. And so in location 4, there's no sense of agency, no sense that you can do anything, no sense that you can make any decisions or anything like that. Life just seems to be synchronistically unfolding, if you will. There's no emotion there. There's no self-related thoughts. And so on. So it's a very different kind of place. A lot of people look at this and they're like, they're like, oh my gosh, well, location 3 sounds great, but location 4, I never want to go to location 4, and they get a little scared of it. It's important to realize, if you ask people in location 4, hey, how is this for you? And they're like, oh man, the sense of freedom here is beyond, location 3 was great. Location 2 is great. Man, the sense of freedom here in location 4, it's just unparalleled. Just feels amazing. Right. And so don't look at this list from your mind right now and from your perception of what that might be like. It's one of those things where you kind of just got to experience it. 5 and beyond, that's a little bit too esoteric for us today. So we're just going to hit these 4. Let me talk about the layers. So layer 1 is basically mind. It's still very much the mind. And so all these things that you normally have in your mind, which are on your screen right now, they still exist in layer 1, but it's kind of the fundamental well-being version of mind, right? So it's that sense that everything is okay version of this type of thing, right? But nonetheless, you can still be, thinking about the future, creating a vision for your life. And it's, the mind is still pretty much convinced that it's right here, and all of that other type of stuff. And so this is also a little confusing. I think that's why a lot of traditions didn't necessarily include something like location 1, layer 1 in their taxonomies, even ones like, for instance, Tibetan Buddhism, which has quite a range of these as part of its knowledge base. Layer 2 is really the first place that you start to hear spiritual teachers talking about on YouTube and workshops and stuff like that, right? So when you get to location 2, layer 2, you kind of feel like, okay, this is sounding familiar. I've made it. I've finally made it. I'm finally in fundamental well-being, and so it feels like everything is just here. It's all just, arising on its own. And that might sound like a simple statement, but there's a sense of kind of the miraculous to that, especially when you first experience it. It's just like, wow, it's just all arising on its own, and it sounds a little funny when I say it maybe in this presentation, but it's got a profound feeling and impact that comes along with it. It's words like spaciousness, emptiness that are associated with this. And so if you've heard people talking about this that are into some form of fundamental well-being, maybe your favorite teacher or something like that, it's really because the mind you're getting some distance from the mind. The mind was filling everything up. It was commenting on everything. It was labeling everything. It was coloring everything. And now you're starting to get some distance from it, right? And that distance is going to feel like emptiness and or spaciousness. Some people will just say emptiness. Some people will just say spaciousness. For some people, it'll be spacious emptiness. It feels like the spaciousness or the emptiness contains everything, that everything is actually made out of it. And so if you really got the experience maxed out, you might say something like this: everything is spacious emptiness, right? So that's kind of the maxed out location 2, layer 2, especially layer 2 in general type of experience. However, remember that you can also never get to that point, and that's totally fine. It might just be spaciousness that you're perceiving. It might just be that everything feels empty. All right, so the all-containing spacious emptiness is another way to say that. So what are you really doing here? Well, what you're doing is you're going from being in location 1, say, embedded in thoughts and emotions, to a meta-awareness of those thoughts and emotions. In other words, you're not those thoughts and emotions. You're getting some distance from those thoughts and emotions, right? And then you're going from there to a sense or awareness of a spaciousness or an emptiness or a spacious emptiness or an all-containing spacious emptiness, whatever you get. But it's just a sense of it. It's like, oh, I just feel like right here, it just feels like something is there, It's just, I can almost put I just can't quite, It's that type of sense. It's coming in. It's starting to come in. You're starting to get attuned to it. You're starting to get some experience of it. And then you have the direct experience of it. Again, could just be spaciousness, could just be emptiness, could be both of them, whatever. And then finally, if you really deepen into layer 2, you are the spaciousness, or you are the emptiness. And you're like, oh my gosh, I'm not my thoughts. I'm not my feelings. I'm the spaciousness, or I'm the emptiness, or whatever. And that really does feel like, oh, that's the truth of who and what I am. Okay, layer 3. So in layer 3, it's best expressed, if you're really sort of fully experiencing it, as an all-pervading field of presence or beingness that feels profoundly rich, complete, full, and alive. An all-pervading field, right? So everything you look at, everything you feel, every experience, every aspect of every experience that you have has this field kind of pervading, has this experience pervading it that is rich, complete, full, alive. Let me contrast this with layer 2 for you. It's a fullness versus an emptiness. It's permeating and infusing versus being the container for, or being what things are made out of, right? So the spaciousness of the emptiness, everything was made out of it, right? That's not the case with this fullness. Some describe the transition to this as a container dissolving, sort of like the stuff that was the spaciousness container or the spacious emptiness container or whatever sort of dissolving. Some, it's an infinite expansion. And then this fullness basically coming in. Again, a pervasive field. It's, as we go through these, your experience internally gets even more still. Some people would prefer the word silent. That's fine. Not acoustically silent, right? Just a sense of stillness or silence. Why? We're getting further and further away from the mind, which was very noisy. And the further we get away from it, the more still our experience is. So layer 3 is further away from layer 1 than layer 2 is even. So it's getting even more still. There's no aloneness. In layer 2, there can be just a solitariness, especially in a location 2 or a location 4, that is that non-duality, there is just one thing. That emptiness can feel kind of alone. And it can even be a little psychologically difficult for people in some instances. Eventually it settles down, and then they're great. But before that, it can be a little bit of a thing, right? So that's not the case with layer 3 whatsoever. That fullness is very, very different. It often feels untouched and untouchable. And it often feels like what actually experiences the aspects of layer 2 itself. And so it feels like layer 3 is essentially what's making the experience of layer 2 possible. And layer 2 basically feels like what's making the experience of layer 1 possible. So again, we have these things from embedded in thoughts and emotions all the way down to what we saw before, associating with the all-containing spacious emptiness, right? I am the all-containing spacious emptiness. What happens in layer 3? Well, you start to sense that fullness, right? Again, it's just right back here. It's just right out here. You can't quite, you just can't quite get to it, but you can sense it, You're starting to sense its qualities first. And then there's the direct experience of it. Oh, there's a fullness that starts to come in. And it really does. If you're starting in layer 2 and you're moving into layer 3, it really sort of feels like, if this is the emptiness, it feels like this fullness just starts to phase in. And then at some point there's an empty fullness. And then if you move further into layer 3, then the dominant experience becomes the fullness. And you associate with it as you really go in to the layer. So it's like, oh, I'm not the spacious emptiness. Boy, I had that wrong. I'm the fullness. I'm the all-pervasive fullness. I'm this all-pervasive field. Wow, that's the truth of my true nature and who I am, right? So you hear different people talking about this if you're in the spiritual space, and some have made it to one place and some have made it to another, and they'll say things like that. So after that, you can actually deepen into an even deeper part of layer 3, which is kind of on the cusp of layer 4, and it feels like a centerlessness is in the field that kind of falls away, and suddenly the field is very equal.
Jeffrey?
So that takes us to layer 4. Now, for layer 4, I want you to keep in mind that these descriptions are the best attempt at a literal description. They are not woo. There's nothing woo about layer 4. All right? So they are literally the best possible actual language descriptions. Think of them that way. They're not metaphors. They're actual descriptions, okay? All right, so the big change with layer 4 is that there's a primary loss of all separation. It feels like all containers basically just fall away. So all of the prior layers have separation, even as it feels like. You might say, for instance, at layer 3, I am, like I am that, or just I am. Well, there's separation there. There's an I and there's an M, and that's two separate things. Right? It's very subtle. People don't see it if you're in location 2 or location 4 and you're very non-dual, and you're in a certain layer, like layer 3 or lower. You can be like, no, I am the I am, right? Or just but there's a separation there that's not being perceived. Is a separation. This is, that is, right? Versus literally just this, or just that, or just itself. That's the best description, this or that or itself. Oftentimes when you meet somebody, we meet somebody in the research that experiences this, they'll use the word that. And as we continue to talk to them, they'll realize, why am I using the word that? I should be using the word this. It's all just this right here, just this. And so that's really what it feels like. Okay, let's see if we can flush that out a little bit more. So that all-pervasive fullness at layer 3
Jeffrey?
can feel like various things. It can feel like, yeah.
Just one more minute.
Okay, I have 3 minutes left according to my thing. I started it right when I started talking. Okay.
Okay,
I am keeping track, I promise.
good.
The all-pervasive field can feel like the clear light of awareness, beingness, the ground of all being, love, right? These go, so for example, there is neither, in layer 4, there is neither being nor non-being, right? It's beyond any concept of being or beingness. It's like dying to this or that. There's only this or that. Literally nothing else exists. It knows itself. There's nothing that can know it. It's objectless, right? So you have all of these various definitions. It's beyond all objects. You wouldn't say that there could be a subject or an object, a self or an other, a form or formlessness, dual or non-duality. It's all beyond all of these types of things. And although these descriptions sound far out, again, I want to assure you that subjectively it feels in no way mystical or extraordinary. It feels like complete simplicity. So it's not like you're perceiving the quantum foam. You're still perceiving this room, but in these ways. Okay, so if we go through, let me get to here. It's the same thing. You start to sense it, then you start to directly experience it, then you associate with it, then you deepen into it. It's the same pattern that unfolds as you're going into each one of these. You can transition to anywhere between location 1 and location 4. We've never seen anybody transition deeper. And each one of these layers has a certain affinity. It's easier or harder to get to from within a certain location. So you see that layer 4 is the default place to land if you go to location 4. If you just shift into location 4, you're probably going to land in layer 4 of location 4, right? Versus layer 3 of location 3, and so on. Most people will not make it past the first 2 locations and layers. And they'll often experience multiple layers. And so people will have an experience of layer 1 and layer 2, and they might shift back and forth between those, depending upon what's going on in their life. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeffrey.